The sad reality is that today we are living in a world that victimizes the lives of not only the unborn, but now it also jeopardizes the life of those who are just born. We are living in a world where our elderly population is devalued and unprotected, being put in places where they're in danger. World where women and children are at risk for simply using a public restroom. We're living in a world where certain portions of our population are labeled as privileged racists simply because of the color of their skin, thanks to socialist teachings that deny the existence of God, presuppose that there is no God who is sovereign and authoritative in the universe. You call it postmodernism. You can call it post-Christian. You can call it progressivism. Call it what you like. Whatever you call it, it is what is shaping our culture and our society today, and it has been for a long, long time. It is also having a greater impact, a more damaging effect than you might realize on the minds of those in the secular world, but it is also having a damaging impact on many right here in the church. There are two basic tenets of postmodernism, and the first is that there is no God. The second is that there is no truth. And when you remove God, when you remove the authority of the Creator, and then you add to that moral relativity, meaning that there is no truth, that what's true for you is not necessarily true for me, or what was true yesterday is not necessarily true today. When you build a culture around those two basic tenets, it's really not surprising that our world is the way that it is today. But here's the thing. This is nothing new. James dealt with the same kinds of problems, not the same specific issues, but the same kinds of problems when he was writing his letter to the Jewish believers of the dispersion. Turn to James 4, verses 13 through 17 this morning as we continue our series, A Faith That Lives, Just Do It. And this morning we will hopefully consider some of our big plans and then even more importantly, be reminded of who is ultimately in control of those big plans. You know, today, Christians like us, like you and me, we would never say there is no God. As I look around this room, I'm fairly confident. Those of you I know who are Christ followers, you put your faith and trust in Christ, we would never say that. We would never say there is no God. Yet, far too often, Christians go about their lives at times as though that is exactly what they believe. It was no different in James' day. Listen to what he wrote to some of the Christians who first received this letter and read this letter. James chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes." In these verses, James is addressing ambitious plans. That's point number one of the message, ambitious plans. All right, and that's kind of what James is dealing with. He's responding to something he sees in the people in the church at that time. Remember James' focus, if you go back to the very beginning of the letter, he was writing to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. So he's writing to Jewish believers, and he sees something in his original audience that they were saying things like, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town, spend a year there, do some business, make some money. Okay? That's not a direct quote of verse 13, but it's an accurate representation of what some of the people, some of the believers in James' ministry were saying. They had these big plans for their lives, and James is about to throw a penalty flag. And he's about to blow the whistle, and he's about to call them on what they're doing. He's going to say, not so fast. Okay? And that raises the question, as we read through these verses, it raises the question, is it wrong to make plans? How many of you think it's wrong to make plans? Anyone? Okay. That's good, because it's not. If it was wrong to make plans, then Joseph was wrong when he planned to store up food for 7 years to to stand against the 7 years of famine. That would have been wrong for him to do that. And we know that that wasn't wrong, that God was in that God blessed that plan. If making plans was wrong, then David was wrong to plan for the building of the temple. And you say, well, wait a minute, Pastor Mike. God didn't want David to build the temple. And that's true. He didn't, but it wasn't wrong for David to make plans. And he did a lot of planning. David was like, okay, God doesn't want me to build the temple, but I can gather all the building supplies. I can make sure that the land is ready to go, and I can even dedicate this land, this piece of property where the temple will be built. And he did all of that. He made all of the plans to build the temple, and it wasn't wrong for him to do that. If making plans was wrong, then Paul would have been wrong for making plans to go to Spain. You remember Paul's missionary trip to Spain, right? No, you probably don't remember that. But if you look in Romans chapter 15, you will see that he was making plans to go. He wrote to the church in Rome. He said, listen, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the offering that the churches in Macedonia and Achaia have taken up. I'm going to take that back to Judea, the love offering there. And then I'm going to come back. I'm going to go to Rome. I'm going to visit with you. I'm going to preach there for a while. And then my plan, this is my plan, he says, is to go to Spain. And I want you to help me along on my journey. Did Paul's plan work out? That was his plan. It didn't work out quite that way. He did go back to Judea, and he took back the offering there, and then things went sideways. And he ended up getting arrested. He spent a couple years in Caesarea Philippi as a prisoner, and then, sent off to Rome, shipwrecked along the way. When he got to Rome, he didn't come as a preacher of the gospel. He came as a prisoner for the gospel. And we don't know what came of that after, but his plans didn't work out the way he thought. But that doesn't mean that it was wrong for him to make those plans. What's wrong with making plans is when we make plans for our lives as though there is no God, or as though we have the power or authority to dictate the terms of our lives. Sometimes, every once in a while, my wife will say something to me like, I don't know, tuck in your shirt, or, pick up take that glass to the sink, or something like that. And I'll just jokingly, I'll say to her, you're not the boss of me. And then I duck. But I say, you're not the boss of me. But sometimes, you know what? We live our lives like that, right? We live our lives as though I'm the boss of me. That we would never say this to God, but essentially, because of the way we live our lives, it's sort of like we're saying, you're not the boss of me. That I'm in charge of my life. I'm the one who gets to make these calls. And so often, that's how we live our lives. In Proverbs 19, verse 21, Solomon wrote, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Right? Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Who's in control? The culture at large, the same culture that says it's okay to kill babies or to send the elderly into nursing homes with COVID outbreaks, the same culture that says that men who identify as women can use the ladies' room, that culture does not believe in God, or at the very least, they don't humbly submit to his authority. But we are not of this world, friends. We are not of this world. Not those of us who are believers in Jesus Christ. If you have recognized your own sin and accepted as true what the Bible teaches about sin, that it infects every one of our lives, that it separates us from God. If you've trusted in Jesus, God's only Son, who offered his perfect life, the perfect life that only God could offer, as payment for your sin when he suffered and died on the cross. If you have asked for forgiveness and salvation from Jesus, who rose from the dead, then you are not of this world. And if you haven't put your trust in Jesus, if you haven't sought his forgiveness and salvation, then what I just shared is called the gospel. That's the good news. The message that though we are sinners, God showed his love. We know his love in that Christ died for us. There's the gospel. We have to put our faith and trust in him. A lot of people in the world today think, I can get right with God if I just live a good enough life, if I just do enough good things, if my good deeds could outweigh my bad deeds, if I could go to church enough, if I could give enough money to charity, if I could be a good enough person. I'm here to tell you that you're a sinner and that sin separates you from God, and there's not one thing you could do to erase that sin. There's not a lifetime of things you could do to erase that sin. And if that were the end of the story, that'd be a terrible story, but it's not. Because God shows his love for us, and that Christ died for us. And we have to trust in him. We have to put our faith in him. And if you're here this morning, you're like, this is it. That I'm ready to stop trying myself. I've heard this message. Maybe you've heard it 100 times before. Maybe you've never heard it before, but now you're hearing it and you're like, listen, I want this. I want to be made right with God. I want my sin to be washed away. I want to be forgiven and cleansed and saved from the power of sin. If that describes you, if today is the day that you put your trust in Jesus, just tell him that. And then before you leave here this morning, tell someone else. Find Pastor Aaron. If you can't find him, look for someone who looks like they belong here. Just tell them. Usually I'd say tell me. I have to scoot out right after the service. I won't be here to greet you, and I apologize for that. I'm going to miss greeting you, but just find someone. Just let them know, and they'll let me know. All right. If you're watching on the live stream right now, then just leave a comment in the comment section right now. Just say, hey, today is the day. I'm putting my faith, my trust in Jesus Christ. Friends, the world does not believe in God. They certainly do not humble themselves in submission to God. But if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, then you are not of this world. And thus your plans need to reflect your humility before and submission to Almighty God. James is writing in verse 13 to Christ followers who were making plans as though they were the God of their own lives. They had no regard for the will of their Creator. So in verse 14, James gives them a powerful reminder of this inescapable truth. We are not in control. We are not in control. James reminds his readers that they could have absolutely no idea what the next day would bring. Proverbs 27 verse 1 says, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. Have you ever found that to be true? Yeah. I had plans for this last week. I'll tell you what, on Monday's my day off, but sometimes I just have a lot to do. So I was working and preparing for Bible study on Wednesday night, on Monday afternoon. Tuesday morning, I woke up and I was making plans for our staff meeting. Staff meeting never happened. That Bible study on Wednesday night, I didn't have to cancel that as well, because I got this phone call on Tuesday morning that changed everything. And all my plans went out the door for reasons that I couldn't control. And that's what happens in life sometimes. James asks the question, what is your life? I don't know how many times I have read through this passage in James chapter 4, but a lot. I've studied this book. I've studied these particular verses. I've preached over these verses. I've read through the Bible many times. I can't tell you how many times I've read these verses, but it's been a lot. But it wasn't until this last week, for the first time, that this question just jumped off the page and punched me right between the eyes. What is your life? Think about that question. What is your life? If someone had asked you this last week, Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday morning, just walked up to you out of the blue and said, what is your life? How would you have answered that question? What do we think about our life? Usually, when we think about our life, we kind of think of descriptions that are sort of self-centered, and we want to describe our lives but according to our own definitions. But that's not what James does, is it? When we think about life, we often hear people say, "Your life is what you make of it." How many of you have ever heard that? Your life is what you make of it. How many of you have ever said that to somebody? Okay, probably. I appreciate your honesty. I don't know if I have or not, but maybe. Your life is what you make of it. Can I just say to you that's blatantly false? That's not true, is it? Your life is not what you make of it. Young people, you're going to have people that are going to tell you, they're probably well-meaning people, are going to say to you, your life is what you make of it. And what they're really trying to say is that you need to kind of take the bull by the horns, and you need to work hard, and you need to do some things and accomplish some things in your life. And I understand what they're trying to say, but I want you to understand that is false. Your life is not what you make of it. If it was, then James would not have said to his readers that their life is a mist. He asks the question, what is your life? And then he answers his own question. He says, it's a mist. A mist. Can you see that? Maybe you're a little bit too far away. I can't get too close to you, but there's your life, folks. Wow. Here it is. Your life is a mist. Wow. Now, there's a couple of points I think that James is trying to make. One, he makes very clear. But the first point, let me help you understand. I think there's two conclusions we need to draw from this illustration. A mist is moved along by forces outside of itself, right? The first time I ever used this illustration was in the first church that I pastored. It was a small church and at a lower ceiling, and there was a ceiling fan right above the pulpit. And so it must have been summer because that thing was on, and I'd spray that mist, and the ceiling fan just blew it right down, There's the outside force. There's not a whole lot of air movement right now, but there's a little bit, you can see it move, and it's falling anyway. Gravity is that force. That a mist is ultimately controlled by an outside force that if you drive on a foggy day, you know that if there's a breeze, it can move that fog, that mist around. As the sun comes up and provides warmth in the atmosphere, that mist will rise. And so that mist, that idea of mist is controlled by, there's outside forces, moved along by forces outside of itself. And that's really a reminder to us that our lives are not what we make of them. I remember when I was a candidate for the position of pastor at White Lake Baptist Church in Montague, Michigan. A man named Dan, who today is with the Lord, he asked me this question. He said, how long do you plan to serve here as pastor of our church? This was during my candidacy. We had a question and answer time, and that was the question he asked. How long do you plan to serve here as pastor of our church? And I remember how I answered that question. I answered the question. Many of you know our son Isaac. He's been here. He's preached here. He's led worship here. You know Isaac. He was 2 years old at the time. And my answer to his question was, I hope to serve here as pastor of this church until Isaac graduates from high school. Now, I did qualify that and say, but we would, of course, it'll all be dependent on God's plans for us. Okay? But that was my hope. That was my plan. Now, most of you know that when Isaac graduated from high school, I was the pastor of this church. And in between that, we spent years living and serving in Asia. So things didn't go exactly the way that I had planned for them to go. If you ask me today what my plans are, I would tell you I have these plans. But I always have to know that God's plans might change the way I go because my life is a mist, and and there's something else that moves me that I can't control, that it's not me, it's not up to me, it's not my choice. I'm not the boss of me. It's ultimately God who is in control, right? The other point of this illustration of the mist is more obvious because James draws our attention to it, and that is that we appear for a little time and then vanish. In other words, James is using this illustration of the mist to say that life is short, right? Count the seconds you can see the mist. 1, 2, gone. That's pretty short, right? That's what James is saying here, that our life is very brief. And this is not the only time in God's Word that we read that. It's over and over again in the Bible we read about the brevity of life. I'll give you just a couple of examples. In Job chapter 7, verse 7, he called his life a breath. In Psalm 39, verse 5, he likened his life to just a handbreadth. It's very, very short. It's here and it's gone. I am certain that Dan, the man who asked me that question back in 2001, when I answered that question, I said, I hope to be pastor here until Isaac graduates from high school. I would be fairly confident that as he heard that, he was probably thinking, okay, I can envision that day. He probably imagined that he would be around on the day that Isaac graduated from high school. He wasn't that old in 2001. But as I mentioned a little while ago, he's with the Lord today. When we were in Asia, he had liver disease. He was diagnosed with liver cancer. And in just a very brief battle with that, he lost that battle. And he's with the Lord today. Life is short. Life is brief. And we have no guarantees for tomorrow. Again, if you ask me, well, what are your plans for your time here at DRBC? If you ask me, do you intend to remain here as lead pastor of our church? I would tell you this: my plan is to retire as the lead pastor of Danielsville Baptist Church. That's my plan, and I'm hoping that's the case. But I'm not the boss of me. I'm not in control. And the reality is we have no guarantees for tomorrow. We just don't know. All it would take is one other driver driving too fast because they were in a hurry, or one other driver thinking that they just have to read that text message, and they're heading toward the same intersection that I'm crossing, and not only would my ministry come to an end, but my life could come to an end. In my body right now, there could be a malignant tumor. There could be an artery that is just about completely clogged. There could be a deadly virus in my body right now. I hope not. I don't think there is. I want you to know this. Of all those things I just mentioned, probably the greatest risk because of family history is that artery thing. But I want you to know something. I go to the pool 5-6 times a week to swim laps, and I never wake up in the morning thinking, oh boy, I get to go swim. I always try to think, I'm always looking for an excuse. Is it raining? If it's raining, I could skip, Is there any reason I could get out of swim? But I go and I do it, and when I'm swimming those laps and I'm just hating it, there's a number of thoughts that I keep reminding myself of. And one of those thoughts is, I want to serve the Lord for a long time. I want to be the pastor of Danielsville Baptist Church for a long time, so just keep swimming. And just keep swimming and get that exercise in. So I want you to know that. But the fact is, I could swim a lot of laps. And I could get all that exercise, and there's still no guarantee for tomorrow. Because we're not in control. You see, only God is sovereign. Only God is sovereign. Means he's the only one who's in control. And where far too many Christians miss the boat is this: they make plans to go about their lives as though they are sovereign, as though they are in control, as though their life is what they make of it. Now, most Christians aren't going to say that. Most Christians aren't going to say, I'm the one who's in control, but we live our lives in such a way that that's what it appears to be. We make all these plans, just like those that James talks about in verse 13. You say today, tomorrow, we're going to go to such and such a town. We're going to spend a year there. We're going to do business. We're going to make a profit. James is like, do you guys understand that you're not in control? Only God is sovereign. Stop living your life as though you're in control. I want you to understand that that is a very pagan, atheistic view of life. And clearly, some of James' original audience, they were going about their lives like that. And sadly, far too many Christ followers today are doing the same thing. And as we see in verses 15 and 16, they are making arrogant boasts. Look at those two verses, 15 and 16. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Arrogant boast, that's point number 2. If life is not what we make of it, and it's not, then it is arrogant and sinful for us to boast about our plans. Back up in verse 10, James instructed his readers to humble themselves before the Lord. We saw that verse last week. Humble yourselves before the Lord. Is boasting about our plans as though God doesn't exist, or as though God doesn't really figure, his will doesn't figure into our plans, does that qualify as humbling ourselves before the Lord? No. Listen, friends, we must submit to God's sovereignty. If we're going to humble ourselves, then we must submit to God's sovereignty. That's what James is getting at in verse 15. James tells his readers that they ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, then we will live and do this or that. The Puritans were famous for their adherence to this. It was for the Puritans, it was always this humble attitude of submitting to the sovereignty of God. And whenever they would say anything, if they had plans to go here, to do something, they would always call upon the Latin phrase Deo volente. Deo volente, you know what that means? It means God willing. If God wills it, then I will do this. And that's what James is saying here in verse 15. Submit to God's will. Submit to his sovereign plan. That's what Paul did in Acts 18, verse 21. If you remember that chapter, you know that he's saying goodbye to the brothers in Ephesus, and they're sad to see him go. And he spoke of his plan to return to them, but only if God willed for him to return. Deo volente. He said something similar when he was writing his first letter to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 16:7. He mentioned his desire to spend considerable time with them on his next visit to that church, but he recognized that his plans were subject to the will of the Lord. Deo volente. Brothers and sisters, it is okay to make plans, but don't view your plans as though it is your way or the highway. It is God who is sovereign. It is only God who is sovereign. His plans are bigger than your plans. You understand that? His plans are better than your plans. Do you understand that? I think if we could get ourselves to the place where we understand that God knows, I'm not sure you could contain all the things that God knows that we don't know within the universe. I mean, God's wisdom, his knowledge is infinite. And we're just this tiny little finite bit of knowledge. Why would we possibly think that our plans are better than his plans? God knows the beginning from the end. He knows what tomorrow holds. Listen, I've been reminded of this in a kind of a powerful way. Now, let me qualify this by saying that my desires or my plans for this began before I knew that there was a Daniels Road Baptist Church. Okay, so there was no thought of it. But my plans at one time, I had all kinds of ideas for being the pastor of a church, a specific church. And that was my plan. That's what I was working toward. And God closed that door. And I was hurt by that. Just like, God, that was a dream. That was something I really, really wanted. And I've been reminded in a powerful way in the last few weeks just how thankful I am that God's plans are bigger and better than my plans. I fully believe I'd be a very unhappy man right now if I had fought for my way and my plan and not submitted to God's plans. God knows what he's doing. He knows the beginning from the end, and we need to submit to his will and to his plan in our lives. In order to do that, in order to submit to God's authority, his sovereignty, we have to get over ourselves. We must get over ourselves. That's what James is saying in verse 16. One reason we tend to make plans with no regard for the will of God or the bigger and better plans of God is because we get an inflated view of ourselves. And James reminds his readers that when they boast about their plans, their boasting is in arrogance, and that boasting is evil. If you look back up at chapter 3, verse 5, it's been a few weeks since we were in chapter 3, but if you look back up at chapter 3, verse 5, you'll see that James, remember he said about the tongue, he said that it is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. And then he would go on in the next verse to liken the tongue to a destructive fire in a world of unrighteousness. That's what boasting can do. There's an evil about boasting, a wickedness about boasting. Boasting, as we see in verse 16, comes from an arrogant, prideful heart. And I remind you of the fact that James, when he was identifying worldliness and worldly sin, in James chapter 2, verse 26, he identified the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes, and then there was the pride of life. And so when we boast, it's not just arrogant, it's not just evil and wicked, it's worldly, it's altogether sinful. Today's expression, get over yourself, simply means stop thinking that you are so important, or stop being so self-centered and conceited. And friends, when I say that we must get over ourselves, what I'm saying is that we need to remember that our plans are foolish when they are made with no regard to the will of God. So stop thinking that your plans are the be-all and end-all. They're not. To think that is arrogant. To boast about it is evil. If you are so set on fulfilling your own plans with no regard to God's will, then you are no better than the secular world that aborts babies or throws open the doors to restrooms or locker rooms to those who do not belong in those places. The world that does that because they have no regard for the will of God. Either because they believe there is no God, or because they have violated the second commandment and they have created in their mind a barren image of who God is, an image that says that God doesn't care, or that God is love, and so his love outweighs holiness and justice, and whatever it is. The world has either believes that God doesn't exist, or they have this skewed, wrong, faulty, sinful idea of who God is. And it's causing our world to go to places and to do things that should never happen. But we're not of this world. We're not of this world. The world does these things because they have no regard for God. But we are God's children. We know who God is. You know why? Because he's given us this book. This is his revelation of himself and his will, of his standard of right and wrong, of holiness. We have this. You thankful for that? Do you love this book? We don't have to be like the world. What are you planning for the days ahead? Young people, what plans do you have for your life? It's not wrong to plan. But if your plans have been made with no regard to God's will, can I challenge you to go home and confess that to God and ask Him to forgive you for neglecting His will, for not regarding His will. And then can I ask you also to pray and ask for God to direct your plans? And friends, when those plans change, and there's a good chance they will. If you've made all these plans with no regard for the will of God, and now you go home and you confess that to God, and you say, okay, now I want you to direct me. I want you to show me what you want me to do. I want your bigger and better plans for my life. There's a good chance that God's going to change the direction of your life. He's going to change your plans. And when that happens, can I please urge you, don't be arrogant and stubborn. Don't hold on to your plans as though they are the be-all and end-all. Say what James directs in verse 15. If the Lord wills, Deo volente. We have some friends here this morning from Michigan. The Padges. Ray was, I met Ray years ago when he was working for Baptist for Life in Michigan, and then more recently he was a pastor of Grand Haven Community Baptist Church, one of our supporting churches when we were doing missions work. And so he texted me last night. We were supposed to go out for dinner. That was the plans last week, and those plans have changed. But he texted me last night. He said, "Are you preaching tomorrow?" And I'm thinking to myself, I'm preaching these verses. How do I answer that question? And I can't say yes because there's no guarantee in the morning, right? But I said, well, I'm preaching these verses, and Lord willing, yes, I'm going to be preaching tomorrow morning. It's my intention, but we have to understand what God's will is for our lives. We have to say with James, if the Lord wills, Deo volente. Go where God wants you to go. Do what God wants you to do. And with that thought, we come to verse 17. Look at verse 17. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Here James addresses apathetic omissions. Apathetic omissions. Remembering this series in James is called Living Faith, Just Do It. We can see here in verse 17 that theme of living out the reality of the gospel. We've seen it throughout this letter, haven't we? Chapter 1, verse 22. Right? Don't be hearers of the word only, but be what? Doers of the word. In chapter 2, that faith apart from works is dead. We have to do it. We have to live out the reality of our faith, the reality of the gospel. That's a theme here. Just do it is a theme throughout this letter. And here in verse 17, we see it once again. As we come to this verse, we're once again reminded that living out our faith or living out the gospel requires us to do something. If you know the right thing to do, if you know the moral thing, the good thing, the holy thing that you ought to do and then fail to do it, you are guilty of sin. Usually as we define sin, and I know I do this all the time, when I define sin, I usually am thinking of the sins of commission, okay? Those things that we do that are sinful. I do that all the time. I'll tell people, if I'm trying to help someone who is new to the gospel, never heard this stuff before, I'll talk about sin being the things that we think, say, or do that are sinful. And that's not wrong. That is a definition of the sins of commission, but there are also these sins of omission. If you know the thing that you are supposed to do and you do not do it, if you apathetically ignore the good things that you're supposed to do and you fail to do them, that is sin. In Proverbs 3, verse 27, we are told, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Why? Because that would be a sin of omission. To withhold good from someone when you're able to do that good thing, that is apathetic and sinful. Remember Jesus' parable in Matthew 25, the parable of the goats and the sheep? And he divides them, and he says to those on his left, he says, I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Those that are on his left will say, when did we see you in all this need and fail to help? And the answer will be, as you did not do it for one of the least of these, you did not do it for me. Listen, friends, if you know the right thing to do and you fail to do it for you, that is sin. Now, in the immediate context, James just told his readers to stop making plans as though God did not exist. Stop making plans with no regard to his will. So I believe that James has this in mind. If you know that you ought to submit your plans to God, to his will, and to his direction, and if you fail to do that, then that would be sin. I also believe that we can expand the context a bit. If you remember last week, the verses we studied last week, you look back up at verse 7, where James instructs his readers to submit themselves to God. Whoever knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. Still in verse 7, resist the devil. Remember we talked about that last week. Means we don't flee from the devil, we resist him. We put on the full armor of God and we take our stand against the devil's schemes. Whoever knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. Verse 8, draw near to God. Be cleansed and purified from sin. Whoever knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. Verse 9, be grieved over your sin. Remember, the world laughed at sin. The world made light of sin. James says, don't laugh. Let your laughter be turned into mourning. You need to be grieved over your sin. To him who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. Verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord. Whoever knows, friends, the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. So there's the context of verse 7, and we can take the application further, of course. The application for us today can be widespread. Okay? Whatever it is you know you ought to be doing. What is that one thing you know you ought to do, and you're just not getting it done? Maybe it's your quiet time every day. Whoever knows the right thing to do and doesn't do it, for him it is sin. Maybe it's sharing the gospel with that neighbor. Whoever knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. You know, remember last week I ended the message by just asking you if there's one thing, or at least one thing in your life that if you got rid of that thing, it could be a friendship, it could be the kind of music you like to listen to, a TV show you like to watch, an electronic device, whatever. I asked you if there's one thing that if you got rid of that thing in your life, it would draw you closer to and more in love with God. And we ended the service by asking those of you if you need to make that commitment, to stand. And a number of you did stand. I want to ask you, what have you done to fulfill that commitment? Because for him who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. Maybe you were here last Sunday and you didn't stand, but you knew there was something. You knew there's something you should be doing. There's a change you need to make. There's something that you do need to get out of your life. Then I remind you that whoever knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. Friends, we live in a thoroughly secular world, and it can be infuriating sometimes to see how our world just seems to sink deeper and deeper into the pit of depravity. And while that impassioned response is appropriate, I want you to understand that our world is becoming more and more wretched because our world embraces more and more the belief that there is no God, or that if there is a God, he's not the God of the Bible, who calls on his people to be holy, who calls on his people to pursue his will. And sadly, while few Christians would say that, few Christians would say there is no God. Maybe no Christians would say that. I feel confident in saying that not one Christian in this room right now would ever say that. But far too often we go about our lives and we live our lives as though that were the reality. We live our lives as though there was no God. We make our plans, but we never regard the will of God. We know the right thing to do, but we do not do it, and therefore it is sin. If that describes you today, friend, and only you know, between you and God, you and God know. I can't answer that question for you, but if that describes you, I want to ask you to please be honest with yourself as you assess your life today. I want to ask each of you to go home today and ask yourself these 3 questions. And we've got these up on the screen, but if you got a bulletin, they should be there in the bulletin as well, so you don't have to write them down. Question number 1, am I living out my faith in the reality of the gospel? Am I living out my faith in the reality of the gospel? Number 2, have I made plans that have failed to regard the will and the glory of God? And number 3, is there something that I should do, or is there a change that I need to make that would draw me closer to and more in love with God? Brothers and sisters, whoever knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him it is sin. Let us stand in stark contrast to the secular world. I've got news for you, friends. This world is not going to be changed through politics or political activism. It's not going to be changed through legislations. It can only be changed by the power of the gospel, and that cannot happen until God's people are living out the reality of that gospel. Whoever knows the right thing to do and does not do it, for him, it is sin.